Then over this grisaille ébauche, the local colour is applied very simply, almost like colouring in a drawing. The creamy colour of the dress, which is lead white with a little yellow ochre, brown castle earth and cobalt blue, is, however, given by blending subtly different varied tints of this cream colour, in which the proportions of the earth pigments and blues are slightly varied to give the modelling of the dress. Clearly, in a world where immediacy and spontaneity in the setting down of the image was desired, this method of painting was impossible. It took too long, and it had to be done in the studio. Even though many later painters laid out their design in a neutral or subdued colour or range of colours, and then applied local colour as required, and I mentioned in Degas' painting of Hélène Rouard, we could see the brownish underpaint shimmering through the blue of her dress. They abbreviated this time-consuming process. They would still set out their palette, ordering the colours in a manner logical for their method of painting, but the blending of the colours was achieved immediately on the palette or on the painting itself, not by the construction of many subtly different tones in advance. In addition, certain technical developments had liberated the artist from the difficulties of working away from the studio, changed the relationship the artist had with the producer of his paint, and, most important of all, had introduced a range of new pigments to the artist's palette. One of the most liberating changes for the painter was the development of a resealable container for the paint, the tube. This was so much more convenient to carry around than the bladders used for storage previously, and bladders were not suitable for long-term storage. They were not impermeable, and the paint gradually hardened as the oil oxidized and began to dry. So there we have some bladders. And you can see the screw-top lids of the tubes, exactly the same as today's paint tubes. The shelf life of the paint was increased when it was in the tube, although various additives might be needed to prevent settling of the pigment, particularly in the case of heavy pigments like vermilion. And the easy convenience of the tubes made the paint suitable for the amateur market. Most important of all, they were easily portable. They revolutionized painting away from the confines of the studio. At the beginning of the century, chemistry was still a very young science, but the work of chemists like Antoine Lavoisier and others at the end of the 18th century and the beginning of the 19th had made it possible to develop a greater understanding of chemical elements and their properties, particularly those of the different metals. Much of this progress was stimulated by research into various minerals, which resulted in the isolation of several new metallic elements, including chromium and cadmium. Improvements in methods of chemical analysis enabled a greater comprehension of how compounds were formed, and thus allowed chemical properties and the results of chemical reactions to be predicted and expressed as formulae. The mechanism of a reaction could be expressed as an equation. The chemistry of minerals and metals, essentially inorganic chemistry, had become a systematic science. Organic chemistry, the chemistry of carbon and its compounds, and the science underlying all life and its processes, barely existed at the beginning of the 19th century. Yet by the end of the century, the way in which carbon atoms might link together and bond with other elements, such as oxygen and nitrogen, could also be expressed by chemical formulae and equations. Later research might require corrections to be made to these structures, equations, reaction mechanisms, but the fact that a mechanism, inorganic or organic, could to some extent be predicted allowed the possibility of synthesis of compounds, including compounds that had never been synthesized before, in a reliable and predictable manner. The door for the production of a hitherto unknown variety of materials on a large scale had been opened. For painters, the most exciting result of this flowering of chemical understanding was the development of several new pigments. After Louis-Nicolas Vauquelin isolated chromium from crocoite in 1797, he described a number of its brightly coloured compounds in 1809. These included the chrome yellows and oranges, all chromates of lead, or for more lemon yellows, barium, strontium, or zinc. And a selection of these can be seen in this detail from the Van Gogh painting we saw earlier, the wheat field with cypresses. And he's used quite a number of different chrome yellows. Because chrome yellows had a high tinting strength, they were frequently extended with white materials, such as zinc oxide, barium or lead or calcium sulfates, which modified their translucency or handling properties. Chrome yellows were very easy to make, but required careful processing and finishing, or else the colour could be unstable. Monet is well known to have complained about a dreadful chrome, although he did continue to use chrome yellows, and a lemon yellow zinc chromate used by Georges Seurat in his modifications to the Baies des Agnières, and in A Sunday on the Grand Jatte of 1884-6, has darkened due to the formation of green chromic oxide. Now, some of the dots on this hat are actually, they're not a nice yellow, they're a rather nasty orange. And here, these dots, and there's some greenish colours. I'm sorry, this is not a very good reproduction. But you have to imagine that originally these greenish would originally have been a bright yellow. Cadmium sulfide yellows were far more stable, but very much more expensive. The intense, cold, translucent green of viridian, hydrated chromium oxide, which is vert émeraude in French, it's viridian there, was, however, completely stable and came to be widely used for this reason, in spite of its relatively high price. It first appeared in the 1830s, developed by a Parisian colour maker named Panetier, another synthesis being patented by Guigné in 1859. Another vivid green, copper acetoarsenite, emerald or Schweinfurt green, and confusingly this is vert véronèse in French, was discovered in 1814, and in spite of the fact that it was poisonous, it became extremely popular because of its vibrant colour, previously unobtainable. You cannot get that colour by mixing. The example of these colours that we see here are from Monet's Bathers at La Grenouillère. It's from the boat here. And here we see, it's a bit difficult, but there is the viridian at the top. There's some chrome yellow as well, and there's also the occasional bright green particle of emerald green. The characteristic roundish particles of emerald green are easier to see in this example, which is from the bonnet of the girl in Renoir's at the theatre, La Première Sortie, and it's from, there are little green stripe marks on here, and all over here. The very bright green that you can see is this